We've got Ray Bricknell here, Managing Director of Behind Every Cloud, who's going to talk a bit about the process of choosing the right IT vendor and some of the ways to do that and some of the pitfalls. It's an important topic, of course, because IT services and systems are at the heart of your businesses, whether you are a CIO or you're otherwise engaged in the IT function, or you're in a legal and compliance function. I'm sure you're all acutely aware of that. They can provide competitive advantage, but equally it can cause great disruption if they falter. So choosing the right vendor is clearly an incredibly important thing. There's also, of course, a great deal of regulatory interest in the use of third-party service providers in the asset management sector. You'll all be aware of the FCA's interest through the Dear CEO letter in outsourcing in the sector. And whilst lots of that, of course, has focused, understandably, on the outsourcing of administration processes back and middle office, there is no doubt that the choosing of an appropriate IT vendor, getting that process right, getting the contract right, is a key part of making sure that you've got the right systems and controls in place around your business. So, as I say, we think it's a really important topic. We've got Ray to talk to that topic for a short period, and then we've got a panel session representing a really good selection of the vendor community, also the customer community, and me as well, to throw in some stuff from the legal side. Whilst you're sitting in a set of lawyers' offices, this is not going to be dominated by, as much as I might like it, as by legal and compliance topics. We are really here to talk about, address the commercial, the technical aspects of this topic. Ray is going to lead that panel session, but of course we do welcome questions from the floor, so please do feel free to chip in. And I'm going to start with a short discussion about the cricket, because I think, okay, maybe not. So, listen, the topic of today is to talk about choosing an institution quality IT vendor and the importance of that in the context of the Dear CEO letter. So, high-level agenda, you've got all the slides, I'm not going to run through it, you can see what we're going to talk about. Format, would love to have some questions from the panel, from the audience to the panel during the session. If it's okay with everybody, to start with, I'd like to run through 15-20 minutes, get some key messages out, set some context, get everybody on the same page, and then we'll take some more interactive conversation during the panel session. So, first question, is IT outsourcing in scope as far as the FCA's Dear CEO letter is concerned? Well, I think if you look at the Dear CEO letter and you look at the conversation that's been held so far, I think Alex absolutely nailed it. The bottom line is that most of the conversation during 2013 was about fund admin, about back office outsourcing, about process outsourcing, the risks associated with using third-party commercial organisations. And the driver behind the FCA's concern has fundamentally been about the shared financial risks that those organisations might have with their parent companies and other. So, the collapse of Lehman Brothers and how that might impact the outsourced operations of your businesses so far. But if you look at the intention of the concern, I think as highlighted by the couple of paragraphs below that, I think as you start to look at IT outsourcing, and particularly as you move toward cloud, then the issues and the concerns are equally relevant and equally important. So, our view is that surely outsourced IT is, if not a critical function, then it's a critical function in support of regulated activities. So, I just want to set a bit of terminology in terms of my understanding, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, is that the FCA's primary role is to look for concerns around endemic market risk that might affect not one organisation but multiple organisations, and ultimately have sort of market-wide impact on our niche. So they're less concerned with the local infrastructure type issues, and certainly years gone by, doing due diligence on business continuity plans and doing due diligence on the ability of an organisation to recover from a localised infrastructure event was a focal area.
But if you're moving forward, the focus is now around endemic market-wide risks. So what concerns, what events might trigger market-wide impacts? So thinking about cloud and the nature of cloud particularly, and IT outsourcing more broadly, as more organizations, more asset managers move towards hosting their IT on a single cloud vendor's platform, then they begin to inherit more shared risk and they begin to inherit more market-wide exposure to an event with a single vendor. And if you take that a bit further, and the PC that I'm on has decided to do something of its own. And if you take that a bit further and think about the impact of a business continuity event that affects multiple vendors, then you start to get into a situation where you're talking about an endemic market risk. You know, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to look at E14, and we all know that, you know, a large majority of the data centers in London are concentrated in that nice cheap land out near Canary Wharf, near the flood barrier. Officially 1 metre above the 100-year floodplain. Well, we've all seen events, global weather and so on, that certainly should be starting to raise concerns about the exposure of the market in general, finance in London, but certainly our areas in terms of, are our cloud vendors located in the right areas? Have we got resistance against those sorts of concerns? And if, for example, a vendor has both of their data centers located in that sort of floodplain, and that's certainly a cause for concern. So I think we've covered most of what's on that slide. So the bottom line is that from our perspective, if the FCA and the working groups focused on this issue are not seeing IT outsourcing as part of this concern, then in our view they should be. Now, how do you address this problem? Well, one part of the solution to this problem is about thorough due diligence and ongoing due diligence of your IT vendor. It's not enough just to do a point-in-time check at the point of service acquisition to satisfy yourself that the vendor you're buying from is robust and has good practices and does all of the things that you ought to do to manage an institutional quality platform. It's about regular revisitation of that, and certainly oversight in the FCA's working group outputs. The thematic review was a key constraint or key component of addressing this issue. So regular management of your outsourcer. Understand what you're outsourcing, understand where your risks are. So how does a typical IT vendor selection process work? I think the point I'm going to try and make here are the 2 points at the bottom of the slide, in that, first of all, the typical process in terms of how IT acquisition within our market is done is that it is highly prone to garbage in, garbage out. So if you cast your net of vendors in a restricted group and you cast your net in a small concentrated area, then your chances of starting the process with the right quality of vendors are immediately impacted. And so, you know, you can flaw your process right from the outset by not looking at the right group of vendors or a wide enough group of vendors to start meeting your requirements. And I think the other thing that's quite interesting is that, in my view, our view, there's not enough open market feedback in that feedback cycle. It's particularly cloud is still a maturing offer, it's still a maturing process, and there's not enough, in my view, open feedback throughout the community to say, you know, there is tangible, honest feedback back through the market to say this vendor's doing well at the moment, this vendor has had a bad year, or we know this about this vendor in the open space. So, how does this process typically work? Generally, identify a bunch of vendors through all sorts of exercises, this being one of them and a number of others, web surfing and a whole lot of others, taking third-party advice. A high-level assessment, you know, discussions with, sitting through thousands of PowerPoints and so on, and, you know, talking to the CTOs and taking their general offer of this is what we do, and then running through where you have appetite to do it, a protracted, arduous, long and complicated RFI, RFP process. Now, in the case of a large organisation, we worked closely with one last year that's a $50 billion fund. That process took the best part of 6 months. It was a full-time piece of work for about 2 people on average, and it involved us starting with 40 vendors and working through an enormous amount of work to do due diligence on the vendors involved. Now, not every organisation has either funding, time or appetite to take on that sort of investment to do this process properly. But in the appendix to the slides, I've put in a couple of pages of the process flow that we would go through for a typical two-stage RFI, RFP process. I'm going to go into it now, but it's daunting. It's quite a heavy investment. And I think on the right-hand side, the outcomes you can expect from that process, we kind of summarise our feedbacks or our views of vendors in a nice little high-level spider diagram, and you can see that you can get everywhere from the good, the bad, to the ugly. And it is very interesting. Probably the big takeaway for me last year was the variety and diversity in this market in terms of what is out there. Certain statements are categorically true. Price does not necessarily equal quality in this market. Yeah, there are a lot of very important things to consider, and that's really what today's about. And doing that well can dictate the fundamental satisfaction that you have with your IT provider and everybody has with you as an IT person throughout your organisation for the next 3 years. Okay, so bottom half of this slide is about some of the things we're going to get into in the panel discussion, and I'd really like you to start thinking about any key questions you would like to ask the panel around those areas. In terms of prerequisites, I think there's a few things that we really need to be thinking about in terms of getting ready for this process. So you as an organisation will have unique things that you're trying to address. That's where you need to be spending your effort and time early in this process. What are the key risks and concerns and issues you're trying to mitigate? Is your estate aged? Is there a concern around current security? Do you have a business continuity exposure because all of your equipment is in the West End and your computer room is in the West End with your offices and it's not in a Tier 3 data centre? Are there other projects coming down the road that you don't feel that you can support the deployment of, you don't have capacity for? Are you failing to support your internal application development function properly? Are you unresponsive to the application development side of the business? Are there a number of things that you really need to be starting to look at in terms of what's really driving you into this process? Understand your own costs. It is almost ubiquitous that when we get into this process with clients that actually they're trying to compare an apple with an orange. You are not comparing like for like. If you're talking about a platform that you're supporting yourself with, one internal server guy who will answer the phone between business hours and has, certain level of IT experience that's broad and across the board, and then you're comparing it to a third-party vendor who perhaps has 3 shifts of 5 people, all of whom are, supremely qualified and best of breed in their own layers of IT infrastructure capability, huge amounts of experience of running these platforms, huge amounts of product and investment in services and monitoring and all sorts of other things that drive a quality outcome. Very rarely are organisations looking at outsourcing to cloud if they're doing everything excellently themselves. So therefore you should expect some sort of disparity between price internally versus price externally. And what you're really trying to do is you're trying to say, well, okay, we're doing this internally and perhaps we're not doing it as well as we can and maybe we're paying more than we should. So can we go out to market and spend about the same sort of money for a better quality outcome? But I don't think you necessarily should be going into it with a cost-saving view necessarily. And then I think most importantly of all, I always draw the analogy, you should, you go out and buy a puzzle. You want to look for getting the box of the puzzle in place. You want everything to be understood in terms of where you want to be for 3 years. And then whenever you pick up a puzzle piece, you're acting tactically and putting it into your strategy. And I think it's very important that early on you understand what that picture should look like 2 years or 3 years from now. Because some of these exercises have lead times of 18 months and 2 years in terms of extracting yourselves from contracts. A large-scale migration should be at least 6 months and probably 12 months. So working backwards from that, the contractual negotiations, don't underestimate those, 3 to 6 months sometimes, and communications links implementations, 90 working days plus all the lead time preamble. So, you can be looking at a project that takes 12 to 18 months to get, once you've made your decision, onto the new platform. So let's think about it ahead of time, not when it's, almost too late and you're forced to do a temporary renewal with your current vendor. And then internal business case. Often see people spending a lot of time and effort on understanding where we can go and la 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 la. Take it up to the manager. The senior manager says, no, you know what, that's not what my plan is. So get your stakeholders involved early. Preachers are converted here, but this is not something you can sneak up on in an organisation. This requires board level buy-in from the outset. So get that buy-in from the start, or don't proceed. You're just wasting your time otherwise, because it is a strategic, big, important decision. I'll come back to the subjects on the panel slide in a moment when we invite the panelists up. But I think, as a closer for my thoughts, the areas that our industry needs to start looking at more widely are, how do we address the endemic market-wide risk components? So this is not something that any one individual by themselves can solve. Technology is unique in that, as opposed to things like fund admin and back office processing and so on, there is quite a level of standardization, especially in environments in cloud where we're moving more and more to virtualization, and particularly on one very, very common product. And those vendors are starting to build interfaces between those layers that allow portability between clouds. So working as vendors together to start to look at this market-wide risk to asset management and starting to bring ideas up into the process from the technology level down. And there are contractual and commercial and insurance and other solutions that can all be considered in that format. So we're trying to drive an agenda that says, let's start to work as IT providers up into that conversation to start to mitigate these risks on behalf of our clients. I think, and the other thing that we think is very important is understanding where is the risk, where is the codependency. So our data enables us to understand, for example, how many cloud vendors have an exposure to Global Switch 2 in E14, how many cloud vendors work with certain platform providers. So if a SAN vendor were to collapse, how many providers are going to be negatively impacted by that? Start to understand the market-wide risk, and actually mapping clients onto vendors also gives you a view of your shared risk with your peers. Are you working with the same cloud vendor as other organizations of a like size? If that cloud vendor went down, how would you, as a group, look to work together to mitigate that risk? Do you band together? Do you come up with some sort of working party, some sort of group? There are mechanisms we can look at. And then I'm not going to get into salesy mode, but at the back of the pack also there's some suggestions about how you can short circuit the process of vendor selection, how you can leverage the work that's already been done by others to understand the market, the vendor capabilities, and whether or not the vendors that are in the market are a good fit for your needs.